It says it's starting. Never mind. Are you checking the
Yeah, I'm checking. It's not,
it says it's starting, so it should in just a moment. We'll see, give it a second or two. Getting one of those little wheels telling me that it's the live video is starting.
okay, I think looks like you're live.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks, Travis.
No problem. Nice meeting everyone.
Okay, so I'm just gonna double check something. Okay, so I believe we're live. So I want to welcome everyone. I want to welcome our panelists, who I'll introduce in a couple moments, and I want to welcome our live viewers, and I want to welcome everyone who will watch the recorded version of this discussion later on. It'll be available on Political Animals' Facebook page and also on our YouTube page. So to introduce myself quickly first, I'm Louis Slosky. I'm a publisher and editor with Political Animal Press. Political Animal is a young and ambitious press, which sets itself the goal of publishing books on real philosophy and serious political thought. And as such, it was clear that we would publish Laurence Bern's book, The Political Philosophy of Francis Bacon, with special attention to the principles of foreign policy when it was brought to us. And I believe it was Nathan Dinneen, who's here tonight, of course, who did first bring it to my attention. Thank you again, Nathan. To note, the author of the present work, Laurence Bern, was born on March 15th, 1928. And so he would be turning 96 years old tomorrow. So this is a well-timed event. Laurence Bern, who taught at St. John's College for nearly 40 years, wrote The Political Philosophy of Francis Bacon as his dissertation under Hans Morgenthau and Leo Strauss. And even though that dissertation was submitted some time ago, it is perhaps more relevant than ever as the world struggles in ever increasing and sometimes new ways with modernity. Perhaps even more than any other great philosopher, Francis Bacon explicitly treats modernity as a project, maybe even as a kind of experiment. And so when we seek to understand what's happening all around us, we must consult Bacon. This is a task for which Laurence Bern is a remarkable guide. Well, there are some obvious ways in which modern science and technology are felt by so many to be problematic. We need only think of environmental concerns or of weapons of mass destruction. Modern science and technology are also things that are widely admired and that people don't seem keen to go without, to say the least. In fact, it often seems that modern political thought is what many people, both inside and outside the West, have a hard time with, even things like liberalism. And Bern is concerned above all with exploring the intersection between Bacon's scientific project and his political thought. And for that reason, this book is quite indispensable. And with that, I want to thank the editors of the book who are here, Nathan and Martin Yaffe. Nathan Dinneen also wrote the very fine foreword for the book. I want to thank them both for all of their work and their support of the project. And I also must thank the wife of the late author, Gisela Bern, for all of her help and support along the way. And now I'll introduce our outstanding panel before turning things over to Nathan to get started. Martin Yaffe is professor of philosophy and religion at the University of North Texas. Nathan Dinneen is associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Rochester Institute of Technology. And we're very fortunate that they're joined by David Clinton, who is department chair and professor of political science at Baylor University, and Kimberly Hurd Hale, who is associate professor of political science at Coastal Carolina University. Thanks again to all of you for being here. I'll slip away, and Nathan, I'll turn things over to you.
Great. Well, first things, I just want to say, wow, we did it, Martin. We have, this published book. Very happy to bring it to print. And I want to say thank you to you for bringing me onto this project. I've been studying Bacon for over 25 years now, thanks to you, whenever I took your undergraduate course on modern philosophy, and I haven't stopped since. And ever since we started this project, I learned a pile more about Bacon. So many thanks to you. Also, many thanks to Gisela Burns for being receptive to my participation on this project. I'm truly grateful. And many thanks to you, Louis, for helping us bring this to print. I remember our conversations way back in graduate school together, and it's been great to reconnect with you on this project. And I want to say thank you to Kim and David for being participants on this panel. It's truly great to have scholars of both foreign policy and Francis Bacon with us to discuss Burns's book. And again, thank you for the time that you've taken to read the book and put together some talking points. I very much look forward to our conversation. So I'm going to be brief because I really want to get to that conversation. And I think a few things need to be set forth, right? So we have to consider how Laurence Bern completed his dissertation at the University of Chicago in 1957, not in political science, not in the Committee on Social Thought, but the Committee on International Relations. So had he been in one of the other two, had he been in political science or the Committee on Social Thought, we would probably have had a very different book, and we probably would not have been privy to have a book, even today, that really investigates Bacon's political philosophy, really with the notion of foreign policy being rather significant for Bacon. And I'll try to just lay that out briefly. Now, so I should say that Bern's study with Hans Morgenthau as an undergraduate student and as a graduate student, it was whenever he went into graduate school or towards the tail end of undergraduate studies that he met Leo Strauss, and Leo Strauss became his teacher and really oriented his way of thinking with regard to the great thinkers throughout history, and really helped him to see the importance of studying the great books. Now, I should mention that we're sort of fortunate to have this book because initially Burns had thought to write a dissertation on natural rights and its relevance for international relations. So we could sense that this might be something akin to Strauss's Natural Right and History, a survey of various thinkers. But I'm quite happy that that was shot down by the committee, and they really wanted him to focus, his attention and less on natural rights and international relations, and think about the foreign policy of a specific thinker. And so here we have this marvelous text before us, and it reads well. It really, I think it's an effortless read, and in many ways Burns helps us to understand many of the difficulties that one experiences whenever they read Francis Bacon. So if we look at the title, right, the political philosophy of Francis Bacon with special attention to the principles of foreign policy, in 1957, a book with this title on Francis Bacon was unheard of. So that here we have some, Burns talking about the political with regard to the philosophy of Francis Bacon, not simply his natural philosophy, and that we also have this attention on foreign policy, I think is quite remarkable. And what he does for us in the introduction of the book is, in a letter to Alan Udolph, he says that this section is keyed for international relations. So he had to, begin with a problem that he was facing, that practitioners of foreign policy were facing. Burns was not satisfied with the contemporary social science, and I think this is why he really gravitated toward Leo Strauss, because Strauss really put his thumb on some key issues. And we get Burns in a way imitating what Strauss does in many of his books whenever he starts them, right? Looking at a contemporary problem and thinking about how a great thinker or so could help shine some light on the issues that we face. And the key problem that Burns lays out in the introduction is this disconnect between contemporary social science and the practitioners of foreign policy. The practitioners, there's a moral reality that they're dealing with as they negotiate and talk about issues pertaining to their states. And what then can contemporary social scientists offer if they have simply ignored the question of morality? If morality, in a sense, has been tossed out because it's a value and it cannot be treated rigorously scientifically. And so this is a problem, and Burns thinks that Bacon in some way can help us think through this. So he then turns to show that Bacon's relevance, and he begins chapter 1 with speaking of the problem of interpretation. Bacon has numerous ambiguities, contradictions in his writing, and Bacon himself admits to writing in an enigmatic way. And so his writing has many different layers to it, some oriented toward common people, others oriented toward the wise. And so this way of writing is something that anyone who wants to understand Bacon's political philosophy and his attention to foreign policy, they have to recognize this. They have to be a student that could grasp the nuances of Bacon's manner of writing. So Burns, in a way, helps familiarize us to Bacon's way of writing, so that it is not foreign. And I think it's quite helpful. And as he proceeds throughout the various chapters, he really helps us understand simply what is going on by the chapter headings. The first real chapter heading, after we get through the problem of interpretation, we have chapter 2, foreign policy, external aspects and the acquisition of empire. So here we are talking about Francis Bacon's political philosophy, and we begin with foreign policy, right? Not domestic policy, we're not focused on the internal character of a regime. No, we're talking about empire, the acquisition of it, and its external aspects. And so once we move on from that, and we could get into it in our discussion, chapter 3, one might think that, domestic policy, if foreign policy is primary, okay, now we're going to move to domestic policy. Well, we do in a way, but chapter 3 is called foreign policy, internal aspects, and the maintenance of empire. So we see with Bacon already, and Burns is very good at showing us this, how the internal aspect, the domestic policy itself, is still oriented to the foreign, toward the external. So the emphasis is on external relations, not the internal character of a regime. Now, this is something that we could also see within his natural philosophy. So we see Bacon's political philosophy in a way being also an articulation of his natural philosophy. Now, with chapter 4, we have the title Policy for Individuals, not ethics for individuals, but policy, right? And so, what this again is suggesting, because Bacon separates politics from ethics, is that whenever we have a chapter such as this, the concern is going to be how individuals conduct themselves in relation to others, right? And so that the chief thing is thinking about how we appear to others, how maybe some deficiencies we have, how we could cover those up. Again, it's all about our relations, external relations. And so whenever we move to chapter 5, to religion and psychology, I think here then we see, okay, we might be moving away from the external. We might be moving to something spiritual, psychology. Maybe we're moving to immaterial understanding of the soul. But no, if you're familiar with Bacon, that's not the case. With Burns's discussion of Bacon's thoughts on religion, we get an excellent discussion of the social utility of religion. And whenever it comes to psychology, as one might imagine, we get a materialistic understanding of the soul. Okay. And so at that point in the book, Burns just lays out Bacon's materialism in a very brief manner, but does it in such an effective way. And then in chapter 6, probably my favorite chapter, it's called The Good, an approach to first principles. And I'll just say this because it's probably the most complicated chapter, but what Burns does here is that he thinks about the ancient discussion regarding the best life, right? The ancients, is the contemplative life better than the political way of life, and so forth and so on, right? And what we get in terms of Burns's interpretation is Bacon seeks to reconcile the contemplative with the political way of life. So in a sense, Bacon tries to surpass the ancients in their thinking on this topic. And it's quite fascinating how he unfolds that. And if we think about it, and this will be the last I say, a lot of it points to the ambition of the scientist, what the scientist is seeking to do, what goals science has, right? So the Baconian modern scientific project has the goal of establishing the empire of humanity, across the universe or the world, or however you want to say it. And so then the last chapter, chapter 7, the title is The Conquest of Nature. And so that is the goal, right? Modern science needs to understand nature first, not in its compound forms necessarily, but in its simple natures, right? And understand these so that eventually one could master the laws of nature to such a degree, or obey them, right? So as to master things so that one could use art to perfect nature, right? And so what we get with Bacon's thoughts on the conquest of nature is an attempt to overcome the ancients, which subordinated art to nature. And here we, in a sense, we see how art can overcome the ordinary course of nature and bring about a new world. All right. So there's also an appendix. I highly recommend that. The last bit of it, it's only 2 pages. The second page speaks to Bacon's Machiavellianism, and I think it's quite instructive. So I don't know if anyone else wants to add any comments. Feel free to do so, or we could get into some of the questions that we prepared. But that's all I have to say for the moment.
Nathan, I meant to ask you, we each came to be acquainted with this manuscript differently. I came to be acquainted because I was in the middle of co-editing a festure for Laurence Bern's when he passed away. And so it was sort of part of the movement of that. I said, well, let me help bring these his unpublished manuscripts to publication. And so I talked with Gisela Burns, whom you mentioned, and I agreed to do that. I wasn't sure I could do any of it on my own. And I was glad. I was sort of waiting for help, so it didn't happen right away. But your story of how you came to it, I mean, what I want to ask you is this: could I say this? You stumbled on it in the bowels of University of Chicago Library, and what was it that got your attention? It's just another dissertation, right? You don't read those things, but something prompted you, and then you went from there.
Well, I've been teaching Francis Bacon all these years in my classes, thanks to you. I see him as a very important thinker. And my teaching is at the intersection of political philosophy and international relations theory. And I kept thinking, well, there needs to be a book that looks at Bacon at this intersection. And I had mentioned this to a colleague of mine, Sean Sutton, and he told me, he was like, well, it's been done. I'm like, what? Yeah, Laurence Bern's did. Are you kidding me? Laurence? I had no idea. And then lo and behold, I learned that he studied with Hans Morgenthau and Leo Strauss, and I was blown away. I'm thinking, I need to see this, right? I reached out to Gisela. I corresponded with her previously with regard to some correspondence between Leo Strauss and Hans Jonas. And so I felt okay reaching out to her again about, can I see your husband's dissertation? And then she said, oh, Martin Yaffe has it. I'm like, oh, I know him. And so then I reached out to you. And, I had ordered it from the library, the University of Chicago, but then you said you had it and you just sent me all the PDFs. I thought, wow, this is great. Yeah.
And can you say what the first thing was that attracted you? I mean, the subject matter in general. I mean, I might be able to answer that question, but not as the first thing. It took me, but go ahead and then I'll say something.
Oh,
Was
what
there a
attracted
first thing?
me? I think knowing that he wrote this under these prominent figures, in political philosophy and international relations theory, that is what most attracted me. And knowing that you were working on it helped as well. So I thought, well, if Martin's working on it, then it has to be worthwhile. Because I should say this, I never met Laurence Burns, right? And so I've come to know him via his book, and in a sense, I wish I did know him.
Yeah, remarkable person. I quickly, as an anecdote, I remember my first impression of actually looking at Bacon's prose as a freshman in my first week of school. This is at University College Toronto, and I wasn't sure what program I was going to be in. They had a very organized old honors program. So I wondered history, English. I ended up in something else. But I saw someone whom I didn't know before, and I said, well, what are you doing? Oh, English. Well, what do they have you reading? Oh, Francis Bacon. I said, well, what's that? Or can you show me what that is? And she showed me a page or two, and I said to myself, yes, this is recognizable English. I mean, I'd read some Shakespeare. In those days, the high schools pulled us through 5 different plays. We had 5 years of high school in Ontario in those days. But I was just baffled. And this leads to what I most, I think, appreciate in general about having spent some time with this manuscript. And that is, you find that Laurence, if I could call him by his first name, shows right from the beginning, or by the end of the first chapter, what we're dealing with and what Bacon is dealing with is 3 different authorities. And in a way, we share those authorities. On the one hand, you have the authority of Machiavelli, who's sort of prominent and turns heads and worse. But then you have the moral authority of religion, of a Christian teaching, in Britain for sure, and all, as well as the heritage of classical political philosophy, but Aristotle and Plato, but as shepherded through, partly as nurtured by the scholastic universities, but as recovered also by the Renaissance scholars. So you have these three authorities, and then it turns out that Bacon is negotiating with these or through these, and Laurence is taking us through. It's as if what Bacon is inviting us to do, and this is Burns's point, and what Laurence himself in his manuscript is inviting us to do, is to undergo that same experience of having to ponder each of these three authorities and how they fit or don't fit, or what. And in a way, that's the drama of the book. I mean, we start with external affairs because that's where these things show up first, at least between Plato, Aristotle on the one hand and Machiavelli. And then we begin to see, well, where does, it takes a few chapters, but we're negotiating, but we begin to see, well, where does Christianity fit in? Is it going to get lost in the cracks? And what is the case for it? Is it a viable case or what? And by that time, we're well into the argument, and we're used to these details. As I say, the key point, this is really my key point. You have to sort of live through this, and then you understand it. You can begin to come to understand it as Bacon does. Well, let me say one more thing. If the difficulty that Burns is pointing out with modern social science and its approach to foreign affairs has to do with its remoteness from the moral questions that are really there on the surface, but not for the scholars, because the scholars are following a method that separates off facts from values, so-called. So just by shepherding us through the moral questions on the level of the moral questions and showing how they both depend on and lead to the moral contemplation we need, I think the book does us a wonderful service.
I can't agree more. Yeah.
The noises in the background, by the way, are thunder. It's not me personally. I'm going to brave this out. So
yeah, so I think what you said, as you move through the book, some of the ambiguities, many of them, I would say, and the three ones that you mentioned are clarified, at least from Burns's point of view. And he might be right or wrong. I mean, I tend to agree with him. I've learned a lot. What I've learned from Burns is that you have to read wide and far as well as in between to really grasp Bacon's project. And for the longest time, I just worked through the New Atlantis and the preface and the plan of the Great Instauration, and the aphorisms and the New Organon on the Idols of the Mind. But once I started reading Burns, I thought, man, I need to read The Advancement of Learning. I need to read the Latin extended version of it, and I have to read way more. And so I've been busy doing that thanks to him. And I have some
Henry
work in
VIII
my.
as well, or Henry the Seventh. It's
What's that?
The reign of Henry the Seventh as well for this book especially.
Yeah,
it's key. Yeah.
Yeah, I picked that one up as well. So what are your thoughts, Kim?
Yeah, I thought it was a great book. It was a strange experience reading it, as I guess I would be like a third generation Bacon scholar from this point forward, because this is so much of kind of my graduate education was very much in line with Burns's understanding of Bacon. And I do think he does a really good job of bringing together the disparate parts of Bacon's project and showing how they all fit together, because you can't understand the political project without considering the scientific project, and neither of them make sense without the philosophical project. And so I do think he does a really great job of resisting the temptation that kind of comes with the fragmentation of the social sciences, particularly political science, of specializing. And as you're just saying, thinking that you can understand Bacon's thoughts on foreign policy by just studying his writings on foreign policy and war without actually considering what war does to science. You always have to, with Bacon, keep the bigger picture in mind. What is his ultimate goal? And all of the other kind of, I don't want to say subfields or sub questions are in service of the scientific project. And so we have to consider, hey, what is the purpose of the scientific project? What is the end goal of modernity? And how do all of these different parts get us there? How do we use Machiavelli and religion and, the kind of nobility of the ancients to get us to where Bacon wants us to be?
Yeah. No, very good. David, I think you're muted. Are you trying to say something?
I hope not.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Maybe you hope so.
Oh, yeah, I was wondering, perhaps you could say
I-
a few things, in terms of what you might have learned.
Well, I've learned already an awful lot just from the discussion that we've heard so far, and something that Kim said in particular, but the point that I seem to discern, and what a lot of people have said, you talk about Bacon's project as involving the conquest of nature, perhaps by obeying nature, we're going to conquer it. Is Bacon's political aim the conquest of international politics? That is, through the successful project of expansion and empire, we remove the international, we escape from the necessities of international life, we escape whatever distortion of the scientific project is caused by the diversion into projects for military preparedness, offensive or defensive. And we therefore enter into a more philosophical realm. Is this part of Bacon's ambition for people who understand what he's writing about? Does he believe that we can escape the realm of necessity of international relations and attain a kind of political life that has more room for reason and for philosophy more deeply understood?
I have thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, so I think yes and no. And in the kind of talking points I sent in, I tried to kind of articulate this a little bit. Bacon did think that conditions of peace were best for science, that scientific creativity would flourish the most under conditions of peace. But at the same time, historically, we have seen that that's not necessarily true, that war tends to be very good for science. In part because governments will, as the 20th century has shown us, fund scientific endeavors at a much higher rate if there are kind of military applications to the technologies that will come out of those scientific inquiries. So I do think that Bacon's international approach is imperialistic, because I do think that he believes that is the best way to create conditions of peace. But on the other hand, and this is where I do disagree with Burns a little bit, I think the New Atlantis poses a problem for this, because there we see a society that has been at peace for hundreds of years. And, Bacon scholars very much disagree on whether we should interpret the New Atlantis as a utopia where everyone is peaceful and happy and, happy are the people of Bensalem, or whether it's a dystopian nightmare of a society that has fallen into stasis and everyone is living a life that is very shallow, that is not intellectually fulfilling, and that does not allow for significant progress. And so I think that, the dangers of empire would be that politics will become static. So I think that there is that danger, but I do think that Bacon has a imperialistic kind of bent to his thought as a way to kind of create enough peace for this kind of scientific cooperation between scientists of different countries to get off the ground, to build truly international kind of scientific societies where we can legitimately cooperate and share information without the interference of, governments that are, that prioritize, I don't want to say prioritize national security, but prioritize the hoarding of information, that don't want to share or cooperate on a scientific projects.
Seems like the most successful imperialism would be one that conquers the entire world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Leaves no room for expansion.
Mhm.
But does Bacon give us any reason, any other alternative for which the human virtues that he praises as the kind we ought to encourage in our population to make them good citizens and good warriors? Is there, for Bacon, a moral equivalent of war? Any other kind of project that would bring out those same virtues?
I think in terms of, we could rethink Bacon's thoughts on war. In a sense, he wants humanity to unite. He says this in De Augmentis, and he wants humanity to unite, to have a peace, and ultimately bring its united forces to bear upon nature, right? To storm nature's strongholds, he says, and to conquer nature. And so the idea is that if only we could get along, if only everyone could get behind my political project, then we would have peace, but there would still be war in the sense of the conquest of nature. And as long as we have not completely reclaimed our right over nature, what he calls, he ties this back to, really thoughts on Eden, the biblical Eden, where Adam had a right over nature. Adam had natural knowledge, and so this knowledge enabled him to rule over nature in Eden. So if we could reclaim this right, then in many ways we would have the kingdom of man, as he calls it, come into being. But in order for this to occur, you need to have the implementation of his method, right? His great instauration needs to be actively pursued. His new organon, his new logic needs to be applied to the natural history of things. And this natural history is an experimental one. So nature is vexed. And so this is part of the new type of war that Bacon might encourage, in terms of there is now this common enemy that we all could get behind in terms of humanity as a whole. As long as we pull our energies together, scientists no longer need to be working individually on their own. This could be a collaborative effort, and hopefully the human empire could arrive. And so this is, I think, in terms of his reference to Eden, this points to in numerous places, and his goal in trying to reestablish the original condition between the mind and the nature of things. This points to Adam's natural knowledge. What he's trying to do is to show how, with the story of the Bible, this story, in a sense, gives us a grand strategy, if you will, that ultimately will help bring about, as best as possible, a new Jerusalem. Now, one could question whether or not he was a believer. And so if one doesn't want to go with a New Jerusalem, well, we could think about an Atlantis, right? But an Atlantis as it should be, an Atlantis governed by the Baconian project, in a sense, would merge New Jerusalem with Atlantis, and then you would have a new Atlantis, right? And this would be the project.
I also think that for Bacon, science solves the problem of scarcity to a great degree, and that will absolutely impact the nature of war, that it will solve the problem of material scarcity through technological innovations in, agricultural production or medicine or things like this that will go a long way towards encouraging peace from countries that are desiring of wealth or that need resources. But science also provides an outlet for the people who are naturally inclined to seek glory, who would be inclined to go to war for glory or for honor. Instead, they can channel their impulses and their talents to scientific discovery. So it solves the problem of scarcity that way as well, that all of the kind of motivations to go to war can be redirected into scientific inquiry. And I think for Bacon that will, as you said, create a new, yes, war on nature that we can all get behind.
Right? Like
we
if we look at aphorism 129 in the New Organon, Burns refers to this, and once we look at it, he discusses, well, there's two types of honors, right? Two types of honor, divine and heroic. And the divine honor goes to the inventor, and the heroic, well, goes to a statesman, someone who's concerned with particular regime. But on top of that, you also have three types of ambition. And this is where I think Bacon shows his cards, right? He speaks of it as the whole truth in a manner. Well, we could wonder whether or not it is the whole truth, but nonetheless, he talks about ambition in terms of extending oneself. This ties into his understanding of the active good, but we don't have to get into that. And this extending of oneself is it's somewhat vulgar if it's limited simply to the regime, right? To be a ruler of a regime, that's a low ambition for Bacon. The second ambition is, well, if you're a leader of a country, to conquer other ones. Well, that's a little bit better. But what is wholesome and noble, the most wholesome and noble type of ambition, is that which brings into being the empire of man, right? That is the most ambitious and glorious endeavor. And he goes on to say, I'll just think about it, right? Think about the honor of the person, of the individual who, in a sense, made the discovery that would enable all other future discoveries. He doesn't say himself, he doesn't have to, he's referring to himself with a scientific method. And he says this person is more than man, right? And so in many ways, he sees himself in this light as the most ambitious person, because he's really trying to pull together the contemplative life, his understanding of it, right? That is much more energetic, we might say, in terms of manipulating nature, right? Mastering nature. And also this notion of what he holds to be the good, right? The common good, or the good of communion, as he calls it. And this is the duty that we are obligated to. And the only way you could really justify this grand ambition, because you have this communion, this good of the communion, and this communion is no longer simply one state or a normal empire. Rather, it's the human empire. And so, in a sense, this human empire points to humanity's ability to basically control the external relations around itself, to make itself live a very luxurious life, and abundant life rather, that there is really no need or scarcity anymore.
And that does sound like Eden. But in Eden, we don't see science and we don't see progress in the biblical Eden. Everything is provided for. They don't even think about how to make themselves clothes.
Yeah.
There's no human art that that is developed there. It is through the addition of the scientific project that Bacon hopes to overcome the stasis that Kim referred to earlier.
Yes, I think yes, through introducing science and interrogating nature, this essentially provides us with kind of, I don't want to say a permanent, but as permanent as we can get, source of progress that we will never be done uncovering the secrets of nature, right? Bacon's scientific ambition is wild. It's overcoming death. It is unpacking the very fabric of the universe. And so he is very clear that this is, his project, the Instauration, is the work of generations. He said, so he sees it as providing us with an avenue for progress that will never be over. Or, at least it will never be over until, the sun explodes and we don't have to worry about it anymore. But so I think that is the thing that will prevent stasis. But as far as scientific progress goes itself, scientific progress does, it seems, in large part depend on, this kind of human desire to glorify ourselves. The scientist's ambition is very important. But again, from the historical perspective, the conflict between different societies is also very good for scientific progress. And so I think that that's a real kind of, I don't want to say contradiction, but it's a sticking point in Bacon's project about, how ambitious would we actually be scientifically if we had all of our physical needs met, we were all living in, comfortable abundance, and we didn't have to worry about war? Would we still be as ambitious to uncover the secrets of nature as we are now?
Yeah, if I could just pick up on that last point, Kim, going to the end of the road that we're talking about, would the image of a human being who has, shall we say, evolved, if I could use that word, to that point where there are no worries of distribution and consumption, let's just say, the body is satisfied, but Bacon, let's just say, would if he still remembered at that point, if people still see a need to learn to read and think about someone like that, to look at their own origins, if they're not too wound up with the next practical task that either they see or some foreman says you must do this. Isn't this what Friedrich Nietzsche would call the last man, the last human being? That is to say, use it or lose it. If the purely intellectual capacities, meaning to understand independent of what you can produce with that understanding, independent of the external product and visibility of it, if that's no longer current or used or encouraged, or including not encouraged by political regimes, are we still, should we just give ourselves over to AI and transhumanism right away because we know where this is going to? Now that's a little sardonic on my point. I don't think so. But
Maybe.
isn't this Burns's point that it's not clear what the status of, let's just call it theory or theorizing, in say the Socratic understanding? In a couple of places, Plato-Socrates points to this inner conversation that each human being has with him or herself by nature. I mean, from the moment of birth. But in any case, this potentially articulate, potentially philosophic. We have conversations with ourselves about how to understand what's going on. And if the answer to that question that some clever inventor comes up with is, be quiet, we're still inventing things, or something like that. Now, there's a rude answer, an unsatisfactory, intellectually or philosophically, logically unsatisfactory answer. Let me add something in this line. I think what Bacon points out about Aristotle that I just really discovered deeply in Burns's book, that it hadn't struck me before, is this. And teaching Aristotle is a famous doctrine of four causes, which Bacon revises in ways we could say something about. But Bacon says in a striking way something that I couldn't understand until Burns, in effect, let me explain it to myself. Bacon's criticism of Aristotle is that his thinking, his philosophy is all wrapped up or limited by his logic, by which he means his dialectic. This sort of conversation that we have with ourselves and others. What this leads to is the need for political communities that allow for that. That is, a mass political communities where you don't know who your neighbor is, or you don't necessarily have in common with the next person the good of the immediate community. I mean, that's decided or whatever, far off. So but another way to put that is this: in puzzling over how to present Aristotle to classes and so on, it's I have to keep saying to students, you know, Aristotle's understanding of cause does not include the notion of force. Force in Aristotle, the Greek word there, means violence, that is to say, what thwarts nature, meaning the inherent inborn tendencies of living things, and that would include human beings. So if, as Bacon puts it, all nature is simply force, that is to say, in Aristotle's terms, offhand, potentially intelligible, but thwarting, and that's another meaning of force or violence in Aristotle's Greek. It would mean the same. But so that is not necessarily attentive, not necessarily fostering living things, including human beings. So there's that disconnect, as we say, between the progress to technological progress on the one hand, and at least in principle, what it means for a human being to live a humanly satisfying life, which would have to include satisfying the human mind as a human mind, as the thinking, observing, questioning, puzzling, and ongoing puzzling human mind. So if we raise the question, is that present in Bacon? It might be, and here's a cute answer, which is not necessarily correct, but you know, as he says with much that the classics and the religious tradition says, well, that's already been done. We don't have to worry about that. Let's just concentrate on the, as it were, the laws of nature that explain other things that need to be explained, which turn out then really to encroach on these earlier authorities, that is, Christian teaching and philosophic teaching. If they collapse into a mechanical or at least material understanding of nature, then their own integrity, let's just say, is compromised. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I do think that this is present in Bacon, and I think it's in the New Atlantis. I think that that's our picture of science's potential to kill that part of the human mind, in all except for a handful of people who would be oriented towards scientific inquiry anyway. That you know, in Bensalem, the people are happy. They're well fed, they're instructed to procreate as fast as they can, they venerate their elders, they enjoy all of these miraculous scientific inventions, and they're utterly robotic. And so I think that we can, and that's why I do maintain that is Bacon's kind of warning that this could be the outcome. This will be, if we continue to kind of focus purely on this materialistic abundance, that could be the outcome. We could create the last man, to use Nietzsche's phrase. And so, yeah, we do still have to cultivate philosophy. We still have to cultivate, activity. We have to cultivate the political life as a way to safeguard against allowing ourselves to become the last man, because that's going to be the temptation. The temptation is going to be to allow ourselves to fall into this intellectual stasis, and we have to
But
kind of
can we do this
prevent it
within
from-
the parameters of Bacon's teaching? Does Bacon give us the wherewithal to understand what that means and how to do it? Yeah, personally, you could say he
Yeah.
himself must certainly do that, but
Yeah.
in what he's giving us.
I think that the closest he comes is in the advancement of learning, when he talks about the conditions under which science becomes genuinely dangerous, is when science becomes separated from moral philosophy. And so I think that is the closest he comes to articulating this. I've never been sure that Bacon doesn't think that that the benefits outweigh the dangers, that that he might not be willing to take this risk, and therefore he puts that warning in there, but it's not fully developed. No, it is not fully developed.
Yeah,
Well,
but in aphorism 129, towards the end of it,
Mhm.
again, he suggests that, yeah, people have lodged this complaint with regard to the advancement of
Mhm.
the arts and sciences, that there are people that will abuse it. He says, pay no mind to that, right? We will, under my plan, we will get the job done, or something along those lines. And so,
Really
yeah,
not.
this is the difficulty, right? So he'll say one thing in the advancement of learning,
Yeah.
and then in something entirely different. Pay no mind, it's not dangerous. And with regard to just the relation between moral philosophy and natural philosophy, again, in the New Organon, he basically reduces logic, ethics, politics to a naturalistic understanding, right? So his natural philosophy, in the end, encompasses everything. It's universal, and the language that he uses with regard to all things applies to human beings as well. And so I think this is really the interesting thing about studying Bacon. You can't simply just study his natural philosophy, and you can't simply just study his civil philosophy, as he calls it, or his moral philosophy. And one wonders, really, what is his moral philosophy? Burns is quite good here. He says, hey, look, the ancients, they spoke of rational deliberation and the ends with regards to virtue. This was ethics for them, right? And for the ancients, whenever they spoke of appetites, passions, and the wills, this was rhetoric. But for Bacon, appetites, will, and all that is, and discussion of the passions, that's ethics. And so rhetoric then is able to bridge this gap that he creates between ethics and politics. Whereas for the ancients, you had ethics and politics combined. Rhetoric then, with regard to ethics, is simply the ability of reason to inform imagination so it could gain some control over the will, and with regard to the individual. Politics is that, but with regard to the collective. And in the end, everything is then just reduced to a physics. And so how then do we stand outside of that understanding, this materialistic understanding? And Bacon arguably would say, you don't, right? You have it. You have the second philosophy. You have physics. You don't need metaphysics. And those of you who really want to engage in the life of the mind, you need to get with the program, right? My program. And
He can say it. Okay.
what's that?
He can say it. All right.
Right, exactly. And I think Burns helped me to understand that. And and how, well, yeah.
I'm slipping back in here at this point. One never wants to end a bad conversation, much less be the person, and a good conversation, much less be the person who's doing the ending of it. But that's the way it goes. This has really been terrific, and we're extremely grateful to all of you, to Nathan, to Martin, to Kimberly, and to David. And I want to thank you guys for being here. I want to thank everyone who's been watching and everyone who's going to watch it. It will be available on Political Animal Press's Facebook page again, and also within a day or two on our YouTube page. And people can read for themselves what Laurence Bern has to say about Francis Bacon, and his political philosophy. So thank you guys again, and everyone have a good night.
Thank you.
You all
Yes,
for putting it
thank you.
together.
Thank you, everyone.